Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
So today's mission is to take a deep dive into the history of Belgium.
Yeah.
We're going to be using the sources you've shared, mainly that PDF, A Brief History of Belgium.
Right.
And the idea is really to guide you through this material, pull out the key forces, the main events that shaped this, well, pretty complex nation, you know, from its ancient roots right up to today's challenges and its role in Europe. Think of it as us helping you get the core insights without getting totally bogged down.
Sounds good. Okay, so the sources start us off with the basics, grounding us. Belgium, as this document says, is, a relatively small country in northwestern Europe.
Right.
Borders with the Netherlands, Germany, Luxembourg, France. And interestingly, this specific source actually classifies it as one of 4 Benelux microstates.
Microstates, that's unusual, isn't it, with the Netherlands in there?
Yeah, it lists Netherlands, Luxembourg, Monaco, and Belgium. It's definitely a unique grouping presented in this material. But politically, it's currently a unitary constitutional monarchy. King Philip I, parliament, cabinet, the usual structure.
And it punches above its weight, right? Despite being small and, as the source points out, not having many raw natural resources.
Definitely. The document stresses its importance today as a center for diplomacy, politics, finance.
It even makes that counterintuitive point about its border with France, its biggest market, somehow isolating it from direct trade with the rest of Europe. I'm not sure I fully track the logic there from the source, but that's what it says.
It's an interesting assertion. But what really jumps out immediately in these sources, and it's a constant theme, is this profound internal split. This duality. The document really hammers home the deep-rooted differences, historical, psychological, religious, cultural, economic, between Flanders in the north, which it calls Germanic,
and Wallonia in the south, termed Latin. And the source gets specific, doesn't it? It talks about distinct social, economic, political structures leading to different attitudes, values, customs.
It basically presents them as having their own languages, traditions, cultural heritage, almost like 2 different peoples in one country.
Which, according to the document, is the source of most of its conflict.
Right. It argues the internal conflicts, especially this north-south thing, have been more vigorous, even self-destructive, than any external wars.
But somehow, paradoxically, the country holds together. It hasn't torn itself apart.
That's the paradox presented, yeah. The source also mentions historically messy relationships between the government, churches, and citizens.
But it does note a more positive recent trend, like finding common ground.
Yeah, it suggests that in recent decades, these distinct identities have managed to come together more effectively to achieve shared goals, despite the underlying divisions.
Okay, so let's unpack this history from the beginning then, like the sources do. We're talking way back.
Way back. Human occupation stretching into the lower and upper Paleolithic periods.
And the source mentions some pretty specific finds that kicked off research, right?
It does. Neanderthal fossils, artifacts near Amblev at Ardrix, dated to at least 250,000 years ago. That discovery apparently sparked intense archaeological work.
Wow. And other sites, too.
Yep. Engis, Flamel Caves, Sclane, Gear Valley, Chalot, all mentioned as yielding finds. But it specifically calls out Skladina.
What did they find there?
The source uses the phrase Cro-Magnon man documents and decorated objects. Document seems like an odd word choice, but that's the term used.
Okay. Now fast forward quite a bit to the Romans. Around 55 BC.
Julius Caesar. The sources describe his conquest, saying he vanquished the Belgians, who the source identifies specifically as the French-speaking population of present-day Belgium.
That's a specific identification.
It is. And another interesting point from the source, it describes these Belgians as the first people in Gaul to fiercely resist the Roman terror, as it puts it.
So it wasn't an easy conquest.
Not at all. The document calls it difficult, long defeats on both sides. It gives a bit of color, too, mentioning tribes like the Brabanti living in a fortified hill village called Bruxelles.
Ah, early Brussels.
Seems like it. Mentions a temple, an altar for sacrifices, primitive dwellings with preserved utensils, wood, clay, bronze.
Now here's that weird historical claim you mentioned.
Yeah, the source states, quote, "This period finished with the conquest of the Romans by Vercingetorix," which is historically inaccurate. Vercingetorix fought against Caesar.
Right. So it could be a translation issue or just an error in the source itself.
Hard to say. But we have to report it as it's written in the material you provided. It does say this marked the transition to the Roman period in the Brabant region.
And then that final kind of abstract quote from the source about the conquest.
The deeper the thought, more tightly was the cord about the neck of the nation. A bit poetic. maybe suggesting the weight of Roman control.
Maybe. Okay, shifting gears dramatically now to the Middle Ages. The source points to the breakup of the Carolingian Empire in the 9th century as a huge turning point.
Absolutely. Led to fragmentation, feudal kingdoms, local principalities popping up all over the region.
So northern and western Belgium, once part of that Frankish kingdom, ended up in West Francia, basically early France.
Right. And the area just shattered into these small kingdoms ruled by dukes and counts. The source lists a few. Duchy of the Franks, countships of Hainaut and Lewick, Markgrave of Namur.
Sounds chaotic, like a constant battlefield.
Pretty much. The source highlights ongoing civil, political, dynastic wars, like the Counts of Flanders versus the Dukes of the Franks in the 10th century.
But some stability eventually emerged.
Yeah.
With the Counts of Flanders.
Yeah, notes an equilibrium was achieved with the first Count of Flanders from the long-haired king's family. This count consolidated power, even while anticipating eventually being reabsorbed into larger empires.
And local power structures developed.
At the law courts, yes. And the source makes that interesting, slightly odd point about anti-monarchical houses becoming the feet of the later bourgeoisie, whatever that precisely means.
But the big story of this period, according to the source, is the rise of cities.
Huge story. Economic growth, social stratification over centuries, leading to this massive urban boom.
By 1300, you have this chain of prosperous cities: Flanders, Artois, Hainaut, Brabant, Amiens to Düsseldorf.
And the architecture you still see in Belgian cities today, a lot of it comes from this medieval period.
Where did the boom start?
Flanders and Artois, early 12th century, probably helped by the political stability under the Dukes of Flanders. Bruges is singled out, developed this complex port, became a hub for textiles.
Right, the famous Flemish cloth.
Exactly. Based on English wool. The source says Southerners mastered heavy cloaks. Towns like Arras and Saint-Omer made fine duvets. And cities like Ypres, Ghent, Kortrijk, Brussels all grew significantly.
And the key takeaway.
By 1300, Bruges and Ghent had made the southern Netherlands the wealthiest region in Western Europe. Just incredible wealth.
Wow. And the source connects this medieval history directly to modern Belgium's internal divisions.
It does. It traces the origins of the distinct regions or countries within Belgium back to these feudal kingdoms that popped up after the Roman Empire fell: Flanders, Hainaut, Namur, Luxembourg, etc.
And links that directly to the linguistic communities today: French, Dutch, German speakers.
Exactly. The complexity of Brussels, the German speakers in the East. It argues all this stems from that medieval fragmentation. It even uses this history to frame the government's later attempts to guarantee Brussels bilingualism as soon fruitless.
So, a fragmented region, but then came a period of unification under the Burgundians.
Right, the Dukes of Burgundy. Initially powerful French princes, they built up lands and wealth, mostly through, smart marriages.
Starting with Philip the Bold.
He got the Duchy of Burgundy in 1363 as a marriage gift. But the real expansion was his grandson, Philip the Good. He acquired Flanders, Artois, and Namur, basically assembled the Burgundian Netherlands.
Quite the empire builder.
Very powerful.
Yeah.
Even crowned king of the Romans, though he died before he could become emperor. His son, Charles the Bold, kept expanding, adding places like Brabant and Antwerp, again through marriage.
But Charles had issues. The source mentions nobles' mortgage to his father.
Yeah, he apparently struggled to recover some lands because of debts owed to Philip the Good. The Burgundian lands reached their peak extent in 1477.
The year Charles died fighting the French king Louis XI.
Exactly, near Nancy, which left his daughter Mary as the sole heir.
And Louis XI wanted her for his son to grab those territories.
But she married Maximilian of Habsburg instead. The source really stresses this marriage as crucial for preventing French domination of the region.
And there's that detail about Philip allowing his daughter Margaret to marry the future Emperor Charles V for cash.
Yeah, 40,000 florins, according to the source. A very transactional detail.
So what was the impact of this Burgundian unification?
Socially and economically, it was huge, according to the sources. It brought unprecedented political stability.
Which you could actually see.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Improvements in daily life, prosperity reflected in amazing architecture. The source points to the guild houses on the Grand Place in Brussels as prime examples.
And population growth, urban expansion.
Yep. Marshy lands became habitable, cities grew rapidly, developing central plazas, town halls, guild houses, marketplaces outside the old walls. Monumental brick buildings started appearing too, cathedrals, the town hall.
And the dukes actively promoted this, Philip the Good.
He's described as a beneficial ruler, used marriage, conquest, and what the source intriguingly calls a skillful policy of violent peacemaking to bring territories under control.
Administrative efforts, too.
Thorough examinations, loads of charters and privileges for towns and corporations, regulating guilds, encouraging craft corporations, all, the source notes, primarily to boost tax revenues, following King Charles VI's example, apparently.
And big economic shifts. End of feudalism.
The source points to the development of wage labor in agriculture as ending feudalism. Important families rose. Exports, especially sheep and textiles from Flanders, drove wealth, population, and cultural fame. Cities issued more longevity charters.
Okay, so a period of relative unity and prosperity. But then things got messy again under Spanish and Austrian rule.
Very messy. Wars, shifting power. Philip II of Spain's fierce Catholicism made the southern Netherlands vital to him.
And he tried to stamp out Protestantism.
Started persecution in 1566, which naturally led to resistance. William of Orange led a rebellion in 1568. Their troops were poorly trained, the source says, but good at wearing down the Spanish.
Philip's response was brutal, though. The Duke of Alva.
Notorious. His elite army executed thousands. By 1573, the rebellion was mostly crushed, apart from Ghent and Artois. And interestingly, the source claims that by the end of Philip II's reign, only Namur was Protestant, adopting tolerance.
Then rule passed to the Austrian Habsburgs, Philip's daughter.
Isabella Clare Eugenia and her husband, Archduke Albert. But they couldn't get the northern provinces back from the Prince of Orange.
And the 80 Years' War ended with this separation.
The Treaty of Amsterdam Truce, which the source says indefinitely separated North and South. The Reformation kept causing issues too, bishops trying tolerance, Philip IV asked to intervene, Louis XIV eventually smashing the religious setup after the 30 Years' War.
The source also mentions some elites actually welcomed the Spanish.
Yeah, those who opposed Count Egmont and William of Orange. This elite, the source specifies, spoke ancient French and looked down on the Flemish common people. A clear class and language element there.
Brussels became the center.
Administrative center, yeah. Supreme Council of State. Philip II himself apparently took a keen interest, looking at maps, seeking military advice.
Then later, the War of the Austrian Succession in the 1740s. More fighting.
Alliance with France dissolved. The Austrians tried to improve defenses, fortifications, the army.
But there were problems. Big problems, according to the source. Army too dispersed, not enough artillery, resources diverted. They supposedly learned from Spanish successes to concentrate artillery, but siege defenses were weak, lasting only 12 days per city.
Battles followed, French victories.
A French cavalry win at the gates of Flanders. Louis XV threatened Ghent, but its forts held until 1746. French focused on Hainaut at Cassan. Brussels was sheltered. French forces were dispersed, but still won a key battle in 1745. The source says the Austrians lost the Low Countries, partly because they oddly put most vital fortified gates in just one city.
So these periods, Dutch, French, Austrian rule left bitter memories, the source says. Wars, uprisings, destruction.
Yeah, but interestingly, the source also identifies a kind of national awakening underneath it all. Reform movements pushing national ideas, trying for cohesion, independence, central governments becoming more accessible.
But then the French Revolution just blew everything up.
Completely disrupted things. Brought the flag, the anthem, liberté, égalité, fraternité. People saw it as a consequence of the Enlightenment, the source suggests.
An invasion followed quickly.
Almost immediately after France became a republic. Revolt in Ghent. Armies swept through for 6 years, demolishing The Hague, burning Brussels, plundering, according to the source.
And neither the French nor the later Dutch rule under William Eyre was popular.
Not according to this account. French tied to Paris orders. William I focused on trade, ignoring traditions. Fortifications offered some protection, despite a failed Belgian attack on France.
Then the Austrian Netherlands officially became French after 1797.
Yes, and the French faced immediate problems, especially with peasants resisting land reforms from 1789, led to a bloody civil war, the source calls it.
Radical French reforms imposed.
Though later adjusted. The source uses the motto, "Everything is cut to Paris," and calls the attempt to impose Parisian customs a blunder.
French influence seeped in everywhere, though. Courts, jobs, army.
But paradoxically, the source also credits French administration with allowing the full development of Belgian civil society, industry, commerce, culture. Quite a contradiction.
And there was unification with Holland, called the richest part of France.
Yeah, dorsal unification.
Yeah.
Louis Bonaparte on the throne, Napoleonic regime accepted, Batavian territory joined Belgium, French influence grew in Holland, then final incorporation into the French Empire in 1810, including the Kingdom of the Netherlands under William.
What were the main consequences for Belgium, according to the source?
French imposed in public office, local languages despised, French legal code, parliaments abolished. All this, the source argues, made people question their very national existence.
Then Napoleon's defeat in 1815, huge impact.
Profound. Destroyed the independent life of the Low Countries, the source claims.
Leading to the United Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Grouping the southern Netherlands, parts of France, Liège, part of Holland under the House of Orange. Meant to be temporary but kept intact. Admired by Europe initially, but lived like a powder keg for 20 years. Too much change too fast, the source says.
Belgium felt suppressed. Anarchy.
That's the picture painted. Belgium in anarchy, fearing suppression. Dutch government objected, but hoped Belgians would just accept it. New kingdom quickly set up upper chambers, codes of law.
Transport was a big issue, an open wound.
Yeah, but the source also mentions bright sides. From the war's canals completed or built, Brussels, Antwerp, Ghent on a completely new coast, new roads.
And efforts to modernize knowledge, universities, schools.
Yes, though the force adds warnings about the unity of power, but also a hope for benevolence through affection. A slightly mixed message there.
All setting the scene for 1830 and independence. The source really paints a picture here.
It does. Mentions that hard winter, concerts on skates, and specifically the opera La Muta Portici, with its revolutionary songs stirring things up.
Then the Brussels Revolution, February 25th, 1830, quick victory.
But immediately created the problem. This rich province was now amputated from the Netherlands.
So delegates from England, France, Netherlands rushed in.
To the new National Assembly, which adopted the Provisory Act, establishing the Belgian state based on democracy, liberty of conscience, liberty of the press.
They decided on a monarchy, offered the crown to a French duke.
Hereditary monarchy, king of the Belgians. Crown offered to the Duke of Nemours, and they sent someone to England to push for independence recognition.
Constitution approved October 6th. King proclaimed October 7th, 1830.
Yes. But then the source throws in those confusing details again.
Right, that the Dutch Republic kept the southern provinces for 75 years, which makes no sense with independence.
Definitely seems like a source error. And the bit about the kingdom being remodeled by James I clearly should be Leopold I.
So putting those source oddities aside, the first king aimed for neutrality, allied only with England.
And the revolution itself started sporadically in Flemish cities, needing leadership. The French-speaking bourgeoisie in Brussels stepped up, founded the National Congress,
which declared independence via a constitution. But the source says it resembled France's, but outlawed the social achievements of the revolution. Another contradiction.
Seems like it, based on how it's phrased. Belgium then entered this uncertain phase, monarchy or republic.
The idea of the former Prince of Orange becoming king disgusted Republicans, the source says.
Yeah. He accepted the throne and not a crown. Anger from Breton separatists, another strange term from the source pamphlets flying. Royal court started small.
And they started building monuments, crafting the memory of the revolution.
As a peaceful people's uprising, led by the Brussels bourgeoisie. The source's analysis here is quite sharp, though.
Saying it forged unity in a new people, the Belgians.
Right. Resting on an older nation, but emerging through conflict and politics. 1830 hammered out a chosen people, despite contradictions, not as globally disruptive as it seemed at the time. Some outcomes final, others provisional.
And the source describes the moment vividly. Sovereign state overnight.
News spreading, upraised fists and oiled guns, street scenes, banners, workshops slowing, news of fire, kneeling before armed citizens. Demand for constituent assembly.
Ogre representing unity. Liberals in Brussels scorning exploiters. Debate.
All mentioned. An official grievance. I cannot speak of my brother. A pro-monarchy episode. The king's supposed question. Am I king of the Belgians or king of the Dutch? Then the Constitution adopted. A real mix of popular feeling and political calculation.
Okay, now shifting to the Industrial Revolution. A totally different kind of change. Belgium was an early adopter right after Britain.
One of the first. Late 18th century onwards, becoming a modern society by 1848, the source states.
But its path was different from Britain's.
Yeah. Coal was key, but shared with the Rhineland. Resources accessible, but the country was too small for enough labor. And unlike Britain, no biological growth or custom of chain stocks, according to the source.
So Belgian industrialists were more innovators than just copycats.
Better organizers, financial innovators, is how the source portrays them. And Antwerp became crucial artificial harbor, global trade pipeline.
Economy shifted from agriculture.
Still started there. Increased production, more land, cheaper transport via railroads, market integration with the wholesale market. Wage labor appeared in farming.
And in Brussels, more middlemen.
Lots more. Forwarders, agents, merchants, insurers, speculators, trade managers in cities, economists, engineers, chemists became common professions.
The source also mentions language changes in the early 19th century.
Yeah, requests for language instruction for local clients. No permanent literate office staff yet. It talks about language shifting to be more mild, casual, direct, which apparently upset excessive poetic liveliness, maybe a move to more functional business language.
Makes sense. And industrialization created a new, wealthy class.
Definitely. A class of the well-to-do. Wealth concentration increased during 19th century growth.
Different pattern from Britain, though.
Source says by 1820, 20% left farm jobs. Another 20% by 1850 when the revolution really exploded.
An economic miracle.
Comparable to Britain, USA, the source claims. But it adds that this gigacatch was plagued by hazards, and the well-off quickly became sheer rich, captures the speed and perhaps instability.
Mid-19th century saw another boom, around coal.
Huge revolution east of Brussels and in the south, banking monopolies, laissez-faire policies, very rich, but for a short time. The lavish antiquities are just reminders of that brief peak, the source implies.
Then the rise of the working class and the Socialist Party exposed weaknesses.
Yeah. Cheap labor replaced by protectionism, state involvement, planning. The Golden Age ended quickly. Luxembourg became the new El Dorado.
Focus shifted away from large industry closures.
Focus on large concentrations was hit by rejection of mass production under monopoly capitalism. Closures swept the country. But the source concludes Belgium stayed relatively prosperous overall.
And more recent trends: fashion, merchandising, exotic travel.
Source mentions a favorable period for those. Enriched townspeople seeking experiences. High labor costs offset by productivity, infrastructure, living conditions.
But the main recent problem is job loss.
Job transfer to low-cost countries, low consumer goods prices, not enough high-tech development, jobs evaporating, even in services. Purchasing power, shifting towards luxury goods.
And alongside this economic story, the source emphasizes Belgium as multi-segmented socially.
Deeply divided. Ethnic, sociocultural identities, language, religion rigidly defining people by birth, influencing networks for everything, education, jobs, family, friends.
Political divisions lining up with these social ethnic ones.
Exactly. Significant segmentation from the state itself. A society with a great deal of internal cleavages, leading to political and social separation. That duality again, structuring everything.
Which must have complicated things during the World Wars. Let's talk WWI neutrality.
Based on borders with non-Latin neighbors, rooted in the 1830 Constitution and 1831 Treaty.
But neutrality alone wasn't enough. Needed national unity.
Especially given the hatred of the former subjection to the Netherlands, the source says. And critically, avoiding joining the great powers was key.
So they built an army, but a specific kind of army.
A militia. Believed offensive armies were dangerous. A militia was best to dissuade or slow attackers, buy time for diplomacy. Gave militarism a social character, rich paid, others mobilized.
They were proud of this system.
Very. Neutrality and militia. But by 1900, they knew it was precarious. Military thinking shifted. Even pacifists saw alliances were needed.
Best bet was military entente. With France and Britain?
Nations it was bon gros with, as the source puts it. But this cooperation just made neighbors more suspicious.
Then the shock. German invasion, August 1914. Neutrality violated.
Occupation, repression, created a dilemma for writers, journalists, against Germans, for French. Left a deep mark on literature lamentations, disgust for Germans.
Exile became a major theme. Surrealist poets used allegory. Henri Michaud mentioned.
Yeah. Looking at the invasion specifics, Germany declared war, Aug 3, 1914. King Albert I's plea for neutrality was ignored. Belgian army, small but solid. Fortifications considered top-notch after Paris.
But the fortifications had issues. Old tech versus new warfare.
Source says they used massive, battered artillery firing cannonballs against flimsy bunkers. A radical new model they weren't ready for. Neutrality guaranteed since 1839. Belgium published a report on the violation.
German rationale for invading strategy, surprise, was ridiculed.
Widely, the source states, German actions against civilians, plus armed resistance, led to brutal repression. Images, houses burned, families killed, image of German brutality stuck, empire as symbol of evil. Strong Belgium committees formed globally. Belgian field press popped up everywhere in many languages.
Okay, moving into the interwar period. WWI hugely impacted theater.
Army theater for troops in France, but shows back home became too dangerous later. Military companies provided cultural aid. After 1918, theater saw a renaissance.
But society felt the weight of the war.
Deeply. Daily life full of commemorations, fears for peace. A paradoxical normal emerged, a kind of half-forgetting of the trauma, need to move beyond the gaping exploiting of benevolence, maybe tired of being seen only as victims.
Collective memory started forming, but the source calls the historical data very incomprehensible.
Yeah, finds it hard to decipher development. Contrasts it with the earlier period that seemed clearer. Low countries, Flanders, Hainaut language, land, religion unified.
But the 20th century crushed almost everything, using terms like mercurials, marsh of sewer, Brusselsization, made in Belgium.
Abstract terms, perhaps trying to capture chaotic modernization, urbanization around Brussels, loss of identity, resulting in a fractured, plural, composite country.
And the source sees the interwar political history as a failure.
A frustrated attempt to turn cultural, artistic, and domestic intonation into a nation. Couldn't succeed, couldn't be joined into one nation.
Calls the history troubled, patchy, a nightmare, an overture of failure. Strong words.
Very strong. Then WWII, Belgium tried neutrality again, hoped to stay out.
Didn't work. German invasion May 10th, 1940, after Norway and Netherlands. Huge refugee influx into Belgium.
Defense strategy involved the Dial Line in the Ardennes, but it wasn't the Maginot Line. Germans crossed May 28, forced Allied retreat to the coast.
Dunkirk.
Yep. Evacuation done by May 34 night. More equipment sunk than saved, the source notes.
France fell June 22. Belgium surrendered June 28. King fled to England via France.
Then occupation, 1940-1944. Initially, exploitation of labor, economy less devastation than occupied France, source says.
But 1941 saw the horrific turn against Jewish people.
Ruinous maltreatment, the source calls it. Confiscation of businesses, assets, segregation, hiding, men deported as forced labor. Ultimately, 105,000 taken to extermination camps. Stark numbers.
Ports weren't bombed, despite being strategic. Rails kept open.
Oddly, no. Economy used for German war effort, ball bearings, planes. Antwerp became the biggest submarine port.
Resistance existed, though.
Low-level movements at all levels. Allied and German plans involved bombing ports, rail junctions, infantry advances. Capture of ports failed. Massive civilian losses due to lack of aerial intel during advances.
Post-liberation, 1944-45, wreckage, rebuilding.
Ports, tunnels wrecked. Decades of rebuilding.
Yeah.
But despite losses, source concludes Belgium was the richest country in Europe at war's end, contributed to immigrants returning to the Congo colony.
And specific reconstruction efforts mentioned.
Reconstruction Commission, gathering damage info, mentions drafts to Berlin in 41 likely forced labor under occupation. Later prints show rebuilding. Munitions factory bombing led to good post-war architecture. New housing office. Specifics like HQ near Suez Canal, south of Brussels. Police stations by Gilliard. Brussels Central Station rebuilt.
Coffee shop culture from a tobacco alcohol ban.
That's a specific detail mentioned, yeah. Carriage building became Terminus de l'Est, brasserie enlarged. Little details of life returning.
Okay, bringing us towards modern Belgium. The 1960s are flagged as a major turning point, industrialization shaping landscapes.
Crucially, until then, immigration into Brussels had been mostly Walloon since the early 19th century. But post-war reconstruction focused on Walloon industrial cities.
Charleroi, Liège, Namur.
Needed thousands of laborers, scarce locally. Mines along the Sambre became foreign-owned. And the source claims middle classes in the south got diluted by unskilled French-speaking workers,
leading to tensions.
The source analyzes it this way. Stagnation and block mobility couldn't easily be blamed on specific groups, so the linguistic battle shifted to the working class, fought intensely.
Working class organization didn't lead to assimilation.
No, it heightened consciousness of difference, leading to anti-Francophone intolerance. Walloon press politicians saw a Flemish onslaught against Dutch in administration schools. Premier de Decker failed to defend Flemish rights in the South.
All leading to the crisis of the 60s-70s. The Francization of Flemish bourgeoisie was a factor.
Spread of French in those circles caused a backlash, especially over Brussels being seen as just bilingual. Verbal violence up, Van den Boynen's government resigned Jan 68.
Pushing Belgium towards decentralization.
Unitary decentralized state. Constitution revised sub 70. 3 cultural communities, equal status. Organs set up from 75. Flemish parliament formed. Source also mentions plans for pro-English measures in employment exchanges then.
And the Egmont Pact in 77. More autonomy. Budget equality.
Yeah, new autonomy system. Regional PINA for revenue allocation. Extension of courts to Brussels based on local right.
Then the 1993 Federal Convention, weirdly called Pakistan in the source.
Very strange reference, unexplained. but it viewed the unitary decentralized state as assumed independence.
And throughout all this, the source keeps coming back to language wars.
At the heart of Belgian history, tension between state duality and atomization of the French-speaking community, especially in Brussels.
Leaders created legal frameworks, institutions for cohabitation.
But major questions remain unsettled, new ones pop up, squabbles continue, linguistic facilities, firemen's Dutch fluency, those kinds of things.
The source also talks about the broader linguistic shift in Europe, the rise of English.
Explosive spread. Big jump in English as second, third language compared to French, accelerating.
And specifically in Brussels, big drop in Dutch speakers not knowing French.
Over 90% down to under 50% by 2006. A sweeping change in linguistic courtesy, the source calls it, a vanishing inconvenience. But it notes linguistic tolerance seems to be going the other way.
Interesting nuance. Though some language predictions didn't pan out, French, still official, Flemish, Spanish, safe.
Yeah. Now, contemporary social challenges from the mid-'80s. Post-industrial economy, big social problems. Unemployment from restructuring.
New economic structure, new social fabric, but weak institutions to manage it.
That's the source's argument. Unemployment, precariousness, social conflict, new movements mobilizing against protection systems or against the transformation itself for fostering exclusion.
And this inability to develop robust institutions is seen as typically Belgian.
A characteristic, according to the source. Contested policies led to gradual labor market reform, basis for active policy, new institutions. Shift to prevention, a radical mindset change.
Did it work?
Early 90s decisions yielded excellent results controlling unemployment. Reorganization led to preventive active policies, introduced 90, clustered into 3 schemes by 99 to boost participation integration.
But the source has a final critical take on economic versus political integration.
Argues they both achieved objectives, but contradictorily, incompatibly, leaving fundamental problems. Economic integration was step by step.
Political integration, though, driven by cultural discrimination, federalization, deep fractures, or disintegration, as the source puts it.
Allows regional self-assertion, but prevents common culture, emulation. Creates conflicting thinking acting in the 3 entities, Flanders, Wallonia, Brussels, coexisting in a sterile and potentially explosive way. New powers at 3 levels hinder the federal state, alter power relationships.
A dramatic example is the 2007 election aftermath.
That unprecedented 543 days without a government. A stark illustration of those fractures.
Wow. Okay, let's touch briefly on cultural heritage as presented in the sources. Admin history shows the shift from ministerial country to federal state.
Brussels becoming capital. Complex evolution of divisions.
Art and architecture. Flemish tied to Germanic and French medieval styles until mid-16th century.
Then a fusion period. Spanish, Italian, Lorraine influences, transitional, decline around 1700, though Michelin had key architects, pre-Renaissance and Europe influence scene, Antwerp's ensemble style copied elsewhere.
Then Baroque exploded.
Magnificent display celebrated across Europe. Late Gothic Renaissance vanished, immense splendor, mentions Kuipers inspired by Paris temples, Antwerp Baroque details.
Artists trained abroad were key early on. Italy.
Until 1530, transferring aesthetics. Mentions de Frent witnessing Brabantine wealth, Van der Schriek's collection, Sacred Works 1590-1640, Minster's Hertogenbosch, St. Michael's in Gudel acquire as a watershed. Master builders worked across the region.
In culinary traditions, Belgium stands tall, the source claims.
Among the strongest in Europe, numerous high-ranking restaurants for its size.
Due to an educated population interested in food, preparing at home, producers competitive.
That's the argument. Tasting menus comparable to Paris prices. Greatest number of high-ranking restaurants per capita. Home of Michelin star, Flemish cooking, renowned chefs.
But also good, cheap food, not typical fast food.
Delicious, low-price options, roadside sandwiches to 2-star places. No fast food mall restaurants in the usual sense. Quick meals from bakeries, gourmet shops.
People prefer eating at home, knowledgeable about food. Cheese sandwich before football, takeaway common. Dining out ranges from cheap brasseries to pricier restaurants.
And a recent culinary renaissance. New places opening weekly, food markets, trucks, tasting menus popular, high-end places hard to book.
Okay, finally, Belgium's role in the EU, a founding member.
Essential part, one of the original 6 in the early 50s. Signed Treaty of Paris, ECSC, Treaty of Rome, E-Common Market, Euratom.
Played a key role in developing institutions, Council, Commission, European Council.
Belgian politicians, civil servants helped shape them. From the late 70s, European policy integrated into federal government strategy to boost influence in EU decisions.
Growing Europeanization linked federal entities closer to the EU.
And state reforms in the late 80s coincided with EU development after the Single European Act. The source talks about Belgium's unique European model of federalism.
Adding a European level of government on top of national, regional, community, local.
Shared by federal, state, and regions communities. Ambition from 70s, 80s reforms was to federalize EU governance itself, apportioning responsibilities, dual representation for its entities.
Reiteration of founding member status, Treaty of Rome, 1958.
Long favored economic integration since the Schuman Plan. Vision of bold federalist integration needed leaps. Work to integrate Benelux markets, ensure common position respected. Key role in institutional structure, Commission, Council, Parliament, Court.
Brussels as host city was contested. A compromise.
Fiercely contested, awarded last minute. Autumn offered opportunity for the federalist faction within Belgium.
Political actors contained internal divisions to forge a common EU position. Successful in that, source says, limiting attempts to push federal agendas onto EU sectors, but notes reluctance to accept a supplementary act for common policies showing variability in engagement.
Broad agreement on common market necessity for economic reasons.
Yes, competitive stronghold, economic rationale. But the source makes that critical point again. Economic ideas disconnected from federalist ideals.
Economic financial policy remained tied to national policies, nationalism, undermining the European agreement. Existing skills traded monopolistically.
That's the source's critique, leading to opposition from those fearing being overshadowed.
And it emphasizes economic and political integration as separate, often incompatible processes in Belgium.
Economic focus on advanced market economy started early. Political integration, complex path of linguistic communities into federal state, emphasizing federalization's modern crises, institutions, partition threat, incompatibility.
So both achieved objectives, but contradictorily leaving problems unresolved. That's the core argument. Economic integration, step-by-step gain. Political integration, from cultural discrimination, federalization. Deep fractures, disintegration.
Allows regional self-assertion, but prevents common culture.
Creates conflicting thinking, acting, sterile, potentially explosive coexistence. New powers at 3 levels hinder federal state, modify power relationships.
And again, the 2007 crisis as the prime example of that violent turn.
Exactly. So the academic consensus mentioned in the source circles back to whether national identity conflicts stem from cultural, linguistic, religious differences.
Is Belgium an exception, or just a consequence of politics lacking true shared identity?
That's the big question posed. The source notes the interwar disparity between legislation and actual use of vernacular languages, highlighting language's power.
French in the city, Flemish in the country initially for service jobs, Flemish nationalism linked to modernity after WWI.
As Francophone elite realized higher ed needed native language, efforts for Flemish services, universities, newspapers proliferated.
Alliance of language nationality clarified. But the source critiques binding language nation into ideology.
Argues common written Flemish initially had no political content. Binding them ideologically was a perverse reversal, incompatible with nationalism tied to a state.
So ultimately, language wars remain central. Leaders built frameworks, but issues persist.
That's the recurring theme.
So having journeyed through all that history from the sources you shared, prehistoric traces, Roman resistance, medieval wealth, foreign rule, revolution, industrial shifts, world wars, and this ongoing struggle with internal divisions versus European integration.
You really get a sense in these documents of how all these forces, economic, historical, and especially those deep linguistic and cultural splits, have shaped Belgium into the, well, complex and often contradictory nation it is today. It's a very detailed, sometimes quite opinionated perspective from the material provided.
Right. Hopefully this deep dive helps you get a richer understanding of Belgium's really fascinating, often quite turbulent story.
And it leaves us, and you, with this final thought to chew on. Based on this exploration of your sources, thinking about Belgium as this historical crossroads, a battlefield, with these deep internal divisions the source emphasizes, yet also playing such a central role in European integration. Does Belgium's journey, as laid out here, offer a kind of blueprint? Can deeply divided societies coexist, maybe even thrive internationally?
Or does its history, as told in these sources, suggest that these internal fractures are just an inherent, maybe even explosive vulnerability in the long run? Something to think about.
Definitely.
Keep pondering that. Thank you for sharing your sources and taking this deep dive with us today.